everyone. I am Julie, Adrian, and Nicolas, and today I will be reporting the topic 11, the behavioral observation. Now, for a short definer of behavioral observation, it is concerned with determining the antecedents of determinants of behavior. When we say antecedents, it is the precursor or the past, the causes of a certain behavior, as well as its consequences. So, in other words, the situational determinants of behavior. And to formally define this type of observation, it is a functional utilitarian approach in that it focuses on clearly, take note, the observable ways in which the client interacts with his or her environment. Now, behavioral observation is the most common type of informative assessment in certain cases. It is very effective for young children, the developmentally disabled, the resistant clients, or those who don't want to be observed. So I guess this will be effective for them. And for those clients who lack communication skills, for those clients who are lacking in insights. Also, behavioral observation may be conducted by a psychodiagnostician or also by other individuals in a client's life, like for example, parents, teachers, spouses, or caregivers, or even by the client themselves through self-monitoring. Now, in using behavioral observation in assessment, conceptually, behavioral observation is a very popular method of behavioral assessment. So, unlike other methods of behavioral assessment, to which mostly rely on people's perception of behavior or their behavior, subjective perceptions on behavior, behavioral observation is inclusive of the process of watching or recording the behavior of a person in typical environments. Meaning, unlike other assessments that are mostly perception based or based on subjection mostly, most methods of behavioral assessment are more objective or are quantitative, which is effective and useful in determining like current levels of behavior, setting goals for behavioral improvement, and to measure as well the change for following intervention plans and the likes. But it depends actually, depending on the nature of the behaviors of concern. Observers may use combinations of several characteristics related to behavior. Now, what are those characteristics that are used to determine behavior? So the most common one is frequency, or you'll know that how often the behavior occurs. Or other characteristics include magnitude, or how intense the behavior is. And third is the duration, or how long a behavior lasts. Now, given the concepts earlier, how do we differentiate the three? So the major difference between interval recording and time sampling is that in interval recording, all behaviors that are observed during the interval are recorded, while in time sampling, only behaviors that are occurring at the end of the intervals are recorded. It is entirely possible that the behavior might occur during every interval but never be recorded as having occurred if the behavior does not happen to be occurring at the end of the interval. Now, the advantage of time sampling are its relative ease, meaning it's easier than the former two, and the fact that between sampling points, the observer can perform other tasks, such as observing others in the vicinity. The major disadvantage of time sampling, however, is that very little of the total observation time is spent actually observing the student or client. For example, assuming momentary means 1 second. A 5-minute observation divided into 10-second intervals would mean the observer would observe 30 times, 6 times per minute for 5 minutes, or for 30 seconds out of 5 minutes. But many behaviors that could be recorded during that time are not recorded unless they happen to be occurring at the end of the interval. So that is the loop side of the time sampling. Now for the sixth recording method, we have the event or frequency recording. Now this type of recording involves the number of times a behavior is observed to occur during an observation period, hence the frequency recording. Now this type of recording involves a count of the number of separate instances of the behavior. So simply, the observer denotes each time the behavior either begins or ends, usually by using tally marks on a piece of paper. At the end of the observation period, the observer adds the number of tally marks to count how frequent did the behavior occur. So the data can be interpreted as the number of times the behavior occurred. If comparisons across observations of different lengths are desired, the data can be recorded as a rate. For example, if 10 behaviors occurred during a 10-minute observation, the rate would be 1 behavior per minute. So that is how the event or frequency recording is used. Now another is the duration recording. Now, duration recording produces an estimate of the time a person spends engaged in a particular behavior. This is how long a behavior lasts or lasted for a certain individual. This is the only method discussed thus far that allows one to make statements related to percentage of time spent engaged in a behavior, although interval recording and time sampling data are often misinterpreted as meaning this. Duration recording is a difficult recording method to use because the observer needs to note when the behavior both begins and ends. As such, behavioral definition specificity is imperative with this method. Now lastly, we have the latency recording. The latency recording is a very specific observation method that provides information about the amount of time that elapses between an environmental event and the commencement or completion of a target behavior. So, most typically, this method is used to determine the amount of time it takes for a person to comply with a command. So, in this case, the environmental event is the command, and the target behavior is compliance with that command. This method is very difficult to use because not only does compliance need to be very solidly defined, but the event also needs to be identifiable. When we say the event, this is the command that usually dictates the behavior or how a behavior is done by an individual. Now, with latency recording, the observer starts the stopwatch when a command is given and stop it when a client either begins to comply or has complied completely with the command. It is the observer's choice whether to measure the time to beginning compliance or completing the task, but whatever method is chosen needs to be used consistently. The decision is likely to be based on the commands themselves. For example, the behavior being requested or the command and the characteristics of a client. For example, if the client typically begins to comply immediately when asked to brush his or her teeth, but then becomes distracted and never finishes the task, the observer would likely to record time to completion of the task. So, kailangan dapat patapusin niya muna mag-brush ng teeth kahit may mga distraction siya. Doon lang siya mag-click ng stop ng timer pagtapos siya mag-brush ng teeth. So, whatever the duration or how long does the client brushes her teeth, including the distractions, doon dapat i-record niya dapat lahat until he or she is done brushing her teeth. Do we watch and record behavior in behavioral assessment? So we list here few recording methods. The first is the anecdotal ABC recording. So anecdotal recording involves recording and interpreting a narrative of behavior during an observation period using an antecedent behavior consequence format or the ABC format for interpreting behavior. To conduct an anecdotal observation, an observer records all behaviors observed, along with what was observed to occur, take note, before and after the behaviors. For this type of observation, it is important that only observable behaviors are recorded. No inferences about behaviors should be made. For example, if a student is observed to slam her book closed, the observer should record slammed book closed rather than student is frustrated. It is either during or after the observation period. It is helpful to arrange observations into a chart that specifies behaviors, antecedents, or what happened prior to the behavior, or consequences, or what happened as a result of behavior. Now, anecdotal recording is also a method of choice when behaviors of concerns are unclear. So, in other words, if one is not sure about the exact nature of a behavioral concern, anecdotal recording allows the observer to include observations of all behaviors. The second is we have the interval recording methods. Now, interval recording methods produce a record of the number of intervals during which a behavior is observed to occur. Now, there are three basic variations on interval recording. We have the recording partial interval recording, the whole interval recording, and momentary time sampling. But these all focus on observing the frequency of the behavior. Take note, since we are recording the intervals of behavior, it is mainly concentrated on the frequency of behavior. And I'll use simple yes or no counts of whether a behavior was observed to occur during each interval. Now we have here is another related to the interval recording methods, the partial interval recording, or the first variation of the interval recording method. Now, partial interval recording begins with the observer determining the size of the interval needed. Now, what is the size that is needed in the interval? This is the size of the interval that depends on the nature of the behavior. For example, 30 seconds is a common choice. Next, the observer creates a grid of boxes on a sheet of paper, with each box representing one interval. If the observation is conducted without the assistance of a computer program, a stopwatch is typically used to time the intervals. Now, for the formal process of the partial interval recording, the observer begins observing a student or a client for the presence of the target behavior. Now, after the interval has passed, the observer records whether the behavior occurred during the interval. For example, if observations are being recorded on paper, an X would be marked in the appropriate box if the behavior occurred. For example, if the girl slammed her book. So if that was done by the girl, then that behavior occurs and that will be marked X in the interval. The observer then observes for the remaining intervals until the observation period is over. Now, for the second variation of the interval recording method, we have the whole interval recording. The whole interval recording is similar to partial interval recording in all aspects. But in partial recording, the behavior is recorded as having occurred. For example, an X is placed in the box if it was observed to occur at any point during the interval. For example, if head banging is a behavior of interest, it would be recorded as having occurred even if it lasted only 3 seconds. But in whole interval recording, the behavior has to have occurred throughout the entire interval in order to be recorded as having occurred. Headbanging in the previous example would only be marked as having occurred if it lasted for the entire 30-second interval. Now for the third variation, we have the momentary time sampling. Now this is the second major type of interval recording. Yes, interval recording, time sampling begins with the observer determining the size of the interval desired. But given the importance of behavioral observation, there are still issues embedded into it. So we have here three issues: the assessment reactivity, reliability, and the way we define behavior. So for the assessment reactivity, it significantly affects the validity of observation data. So since observers are in the physical presence of the client while collecting behavioral observation data, there is a potential for the procedure itself to change the client's behavior. Meaning, the client's behavior aren't always consistent. This is referred to as assessment reactivity. Assessment reactivity can significantly affect the validity of observation data, so steps need to be taken to minimize its effects. The most common step addressed in the literature is to allow the client time to habituate to the observer's presence and activities. Now, what do we mean by habituation? Habituation refers to a process whereby a person, upon prolonged exposure to a stimulus, stops responding to that stimulus. In the case of behavioral observation, the stimulus is the observer and the response is a change in typical behavior. Now, habituation can be achieved by allowing the client to get used to the observer's presence before any data are collected. Now, how do we achieve habituation easier? So, in order to achieve it more conveniently, if the observer is as unobtrusive as possible, sitting slightly behind but to the side of the person is being observed. The person being observed is sometimes helpful. So, in order for habituation to actually combat assessment activity, sitting beside a client would be effective. Now, next is the reliability. The reliability refers to the consistency of results obtained from an assessment procedure. Now, that is how we define reliability, and it is important for the purpose of behavioral observation. Now, there are several types of reliability. So, including internal consistency, we have the test, retest, and the inter-rater reliability. So, the first two are less applicable than the third for behavioral observation. The first two are including internal consistency and the test retest. With regard to test retest reliability, for example, behaviors are not expected to remain stable over time. So low retest reliability is less a function of the instrumentation being used than the characteristics being assessed for the behavior. So the inter-rater reliability is an important concept in behavioral assessment. However, it is important that two observers agree on whether targeted behaviors are occurring. Now, for the strong inter-rater reliability, it depends heavily upon solid behavioral definitions and comprehensive training for behavioral observers. So, the best way to combat lack of reliability is to have consistent trainings. This will be effective for comprehending better the behavior of the observers, since behavior are deemed to be inconsistent over time. Now, the variability, it mentions the issues in defining behaviors. Now, how do we define behavior? Behavioral definitions should have several characteristics. First, is they should be objective. Clear? Complete. Objective means the definition should include only observable aspects of the behavior. No inferences or subjection or judgments should be necessary when using the definition. Now, for defining behavior, it should be clear, meaning that it is understandable to any person who would want to conduct observations using the definition. Finally, the definition should be complete. It should delineate the bounds of the behavior so decisions can be made about whether a particular behavior represents an instance of the target behavior being observed. Now, why is it that it is an issue? It is an issue because behavioral definition should be objective, clear, and complete. Yes, and it is hard to make inferences or judgments based on the objective concept of its definition. Now lastly, how do we use behavioral observational results?